on Film, a program designed to keep you aware and informed on everything that's happening in the world of faith and family entertainment. I am here by myself today. Holly McClure is not going to be able to join me, at least not for this first part, because she's extremely busy right now producing a show for Capernaum Studios. Remember we mentioned how she now is working with Capernaum Studios? Well, she got so busy that she just said, I cannot join you for this first part, which always makes me nervous because I rely on her quite a bit on this, but I will do my best. Now, today, I have a very interesting guest. You all know how much I love Christian films, and I'm very passionate about it. But recently, I saw a documentary done by this filmmaker that just really shed light on, how am I going to put this, the issues, the problems with Christian filmmaking. Not that we're talking negative about them, but just, well, you'll get to hear from him, and he'll tell you all about Christian filmmaking. Let me just give you a little idea of who he is. Tyler Smith is a film critic and sought-after public speaker. He has spoken extensively about this unique intersection of film and faith. He's a consultant with a master's degree in cinema and media studies from UCLA. He has his own podcast, one called Battleship Pretension, and the other More Than One Lesson, in which he discusses films from a Christian perspective. He also has produced a documentary, as I just mentioned, called Real Redemption, The Rise of Christian Cinema, an engaging look at the cross-section of faith and art. Now, before I bring him on, I'd like for you to take a quick look here at the trailer, and then we'll come back and talk to you.
The story of the church's relationship with Hollywood is long, complicated, and even a little melodramatic.
This is my church!
The Bible, of course, is terrific, but for millions of people,
Pictures will be their reference point for the story.
While faith is a difficult concept to nail down visually, the impact of faith is not.
I want to compare faith to running in a race. It's hard.
To show God is to limit him. So when depicting God, a filmmaker has his work cut out for him.
Yes, why do we have to have evil?
I think it's something to do with free will.
The intersection of faith and film is more active, more aggressive, and more alive than ever before. Why now?
Welcome to Faith on Film, Tyler. How you doing?
Oh, thank you for having me. I haven't watched that trailer in a while. Invariably when you make something, you can't help but think about the things you would do differently. And I recorded that voiceover in a bit of a rush. And I realize now when I listen back to it, it's like, boy, it sounds a little bit too official. I wish that I could redo it and make it sound a little bit more conversational. But that's just kind of the way things go sometimes.
Well, I totally agree with you. Whenever I never watch these shows that I do, because I know that if I watch them, I'm just going to go, oh my goodness, what did I do? What did I say? So I really don't. But listen, again, the documentary to me just was a very comprehensive look at faith filmmaking, I guess. And you didn't knock it, but you certainly showed a little bit or talked a little bit about what are some of the elements that maybe are missing, or some of the elements that are not quite done in the way that maybe could be a lot more effective. But before we even get into all that, I'd like for you to share with us a little bit about you and how you even got started in this.
Oh boy. Okay. So I'm going to try and sum it up as much as possible. My background is in film criticism. I went to film school in Chicago many years ago, came to Los Angeles to pursue screenwriting. And as I was kind of sort of working on that, I started this podcast called Battleship Pretension that I co-host with a good friend, and started writing reviews and all that. And very quickly that became more fulfilling than screenwriting, which is kind of a strange thing. And then in 2008, I specifically remember, August of 2008, in fact, I remember sort of feeling God pulling me towards actual professional full-time criticism. And I remember being very resistant to that for very prideful reasons. But eventually I kind of gave in and the doors were kind of flung open, and I had a sense of like what a film critic can be, especially because 2008 Fireproof came out that year, and that really launched a lot of things in the film in the Christian film industry.
Correct.
And being somebody who is a Christian but also really loves movies and is not necessarily afraid of certain kinds of movies, I felt like maybe I had something to add to the conversation. But yeah, so I did that for a while, and then I actually went back to school in 2016 and got my master's degree because as a function of my criticism, I was talking at colleges and really enjoyed it. And so I got my master's and became a college professor working at a few different schools. And it was really as a function of that and the fact that I had a free summer in 2019 that I pitched Real Redemption to a streaming service called Faith Life TV and said, like, there's Christian film is not really taken seriously by academia and by critics. And for the most part, I know why. And it's because it's not very good and not very effective. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't approach it as art and really delve into it and see what it's trying to do, what it could potentially do better, and the impact that it's having on filmmaking at large. And so that's why I made Real Redemption. And I'm fairly proud of it. It's only like 85 minutes, I think. And in that time, I try to go through the entirety of film history and how it relates to the church. So obviously I'm compressing some time and that sort of thing, but for the most part, I'm fairly proud of it. And the film was officially released in 2020, and even since then, there have been developments in the Christian film industry. So it's still a very live conversation. It's not like the case is closed on Christian filmmaking. It's still evolving. It's still finding itself. And I hope that this documentary played some role in trying to get Christians to take film more seriously as an art form, and then also to get academics and film critics to take Christian film more seriously, even if it's not very good. You can still learn plenty from a bad movie. And so that's kind of my view. And you said earlier, like, we're not here to knock Christian film. I've spent a good portion of my life knocking Christian film pretty heavily. And I didn't want to do that with the documentary. I wanted it to be like, I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to say that these movies are great. Some of them are almost unwatchable, but I still want to take them seriously. The filmmakers are no less sincere than the directors of non-Christian films. And so I want to try and take them at their word. It doesn't mean blindly saying these movies are great, but it means at least trying to engage with the films on their own terms.
Yeah, and again, when I saw the documentary, I learned a lot from it, but I did see that you weren't knocking it just because you didn't like them. You were really, it was almost like an iron sharpens iron type of attitude. Here's what's missing.
Yeah, that's. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, was that kind of your idea, your purpose for doing the documentary?
Yeah, that's absolutely that's sort of my view about criticism in general. I quote the French director Jean-Luc Godard in the film, where he says, the best way to criticize a movie is to make another movie. And the way I've always seen that quote, it's essentially the cinematic version of iron sharpening iron. The idea of, like, if you see something wrong with film in general, or if there is a movie that is doing something poorly, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, hey, that could have been done better. Even if you're not a filmmaker, there's a lot of people that say, it's like, oh, critics, it's easy for you to say this stuff. You never have to make a movie. It is easy for us to say this stuff. But at the same time, I think it's possible to say it and try to be constructive about it. And then the flip side is, if you're a filmmaker and if you're in sort of a new industry like Christian film, which I guess isn't that new anymore, but it's always changing and it's always evolving. And so it is this idea of oh, this movie over here is maybe representing Christianity in a way I don't particularly like, or maybe it's not being totally honest about a person's faith journey. So you know what? I'm going to make a movie that does do that. And so it's constant. Film in general, but also any genre is constantly in a state of evolution and self-correction.
You know, some of the films that have, to me, really planted a deep Christian message have not even been Christian movies. I think of movies.
Oh, yes.
I think of movies like Shawshank Redemption, Les Mis. I mean, Les Mis almost got me saved all over again. You know, and what would you say is the difference between some of those movies that Hollywood makes versus that they make that kind of have that redemptive value versus some of the Christian movies that have a great message, but somehow there's no real depth there?
Well, I think the problem is that a lot of Christian film is made as a reaction. It's a reaction to Hollywood. It's a reaction to whether they, attitudes coming out of Hollywood or content coming out of Hollywood, and people saying like, well, that's not what we want. We want something else. And anytime a filmmaker makes a movie that first thinks in terms of what it doesn't want to be, then it's starting from a place of limitation. It's like, oh, I want to make a movie about the depravity of humanity, but I'm not going to use any profanity. I'm not going to use any sexuality, but I'm still going to try and do it. It's like, well, you're going to do it poorly then, And so I do think that some of the filmmakers that we're talking about, Martin Scorsese actively incorporates very frank and very honest depictions of faith into his movies, even in ways that you might not expect. And I think that there is an honesty there because he's willing to go wherever the story takes him. And I think a lot of Christian filmmakers are not willing to go where the story takes them because sometimes it might take them into a story element that they're not comfortable going. And so they will stop themselves. And the viewer can feel it. They can feel when the director is not following their instincts, when they're not following the instincts of the characters, and they're saying, the director is saying to the story, no, you will not go here, even if it makes complete artistic sense for the film to go there. And so I do think that that's a big problem. I've said in the past in other interviews that my big problem with Christian filmmaking is dishonesty, and I don't think people understand. I don't think they think they're being dishonest, and I don't think they're actively lying. It's more just this idea of like, you look at the Bible, it is, understandandably very honest about the nature of humanity. Yeah. It is a very fallen, very broken nature. And even those who follow God, I mean, David was called a man after God's own heart, and look what he wound up doing, even after being called that. And that is something that we as Christians have to deal with, that like sort of our heroes of the Bible are very broken. Now, I find tremendous comfort in that because when it comes right down to it, nobody's perfect except Christ. And so why make heroes out of these people? They are simply figures that were trying to follow God and they fall short just as we all do. That to me is very exciting, but I think there's a lot of Christian filmmakers who don't want to do that. It's like, well, I'm telling a story of someone who's trying to follow Jesus, so I might incorporate some level of doubt or some very, very small obstacles, not obstacles that are easy to navigate. And then we'll get to the end and they'll be happier, they'll be closer to God. It's like, yeah, but it didn't cost them anything. Their journey was not difficult, as opposed to, I mean, this may sound strange. I would love to see a movie about somebody struggling, like a Christian struggling with sex addiction or struggling with like pornography addiction. How many people does that apply to? And we don't talk about it. And because it would mean very frank discussions in the film, I imagine a Christian filmmaker would never touch it. Meanwhile, it's an issue that touches on millions of people around the world, and certainly in this country, and not just in the non-Christian world. And so, that's what I mean when I say like, these films could be doing much better, but they're starting from a place of, this is what I can't do. And they're not thinking in terms of, this is what I should do.
Now, I tend to sometimes fault the viewer, the public that would watch these movies, because they complain about Christian movies. Oh, they're so non-dimensional. They're flat. They're not realistic. Yeah. But then when somebody does produce a movie, a Christian movie, that does get does go beyond the envelope a little bit, crosses the line a tad, then they don't support it because they say, oh, that's not a Christian movie. So I can understand how a producer of Christian movies is a little gun shy of maybe creating a movie that is more realistic, more edgy, more like you're talking about honest.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of blame to go around, as is the case, anytime, and that's not just with Christian film, but movies in general. Anytime there's a trend that is maybe troubling in some capacity, or a genre of movies is being developed that is just of questionable quality, not necessarily moral quality, but artistic quality. The studios are doing what the audience tells them to do. The audience is going to see it, but then there's also this idea of sometimes audiences, they go see stuff because it's the only stuff available. So everyone kind of shares the blame when it comes to mediocre filmmaking. And what it really takes is a filmmaker willing to take risks, a studio willing to take risks on that filmmaker and to heavily publicize the film, and then an audience willing to take a risk on a movie that they might not be comfortable with. But of course, there are a lot of steps there, and I don't think we're there quite yet. But eventually, everybody involved is going to be like, you know what, we need more. And eventually, I don't know where it's going to come from. I don't know if it's going to start with the audience, if it's going to start with filmmakers, but eventually someone's going to start the ball rolling, and everyone will be like, yeah, these need to be better.
Yeah, and obviously to me, Christian filmmaking is very, very important, because while in your documentary, by the way, you showed how Hollywood films used to have some good moral messages, but now they've just gone completely to the other side, if you will. And so I feel like unless somebody starts to create the type of movie, the type of content that at least brings us back to the more moral side of our culture, we're going to be lost. So I consider Christian filmmaking very, very important. Now, you talk about risk. I have a friend that recently took a pretty big risk, and I don't know if you're familiar with the movie Redeeming Love. I think that's what it's called, right?
Yes, I'm familiar. I haven't seen it, but I'm familiar with it.
Oh, I would highly recommend you see it. Now, that was a huge risk. It's literally a Bible story. I mean, it's a story of Hosea. Okay.
That's DJ Caruso that directed that, right?
You know what? I'm not sure, but I know.
I think so. Now producer. I don't recall.
And it was out there. It was pretty edgy. I mean, if you read the story in the Bible, that's exactly what it is. But to see it in a movie, it seemed like it made people very uncomfortable, and a lot of the Christian leadership just really came out against it. I went to see it. I went to see it with my wife. It was definitely pushing the envelope quite a bit, but when the movie was over and I go to the bathroom, my wife goes to the bathroom, and she heard some ladies talking, a bunch of ladies that had gone to see it, and they just felt like that really touched them to see the first of all the love that this man had for this lady that was a prostitute and that just treated him so badly for a while, but yet he just felt that God had told him that was who he had to marry and be very faithful to her. So again, that's what I'm saying, that here the Christian leadership really came against it and probably still do. And yet it was somebody taking a risk to do just, what you said, to make a movie that's a lot more realistic and a lot more honest about the struggles that maybe this woman had.
Yeah, I think I do think that a lot of it comes down to just maybe a larger issue. There is this attitude that film is only about entertainment, and and there's nothing wrong with entertaining film, by the way, but if film is only about entertainment, then the only thing that matters is it doing what I, the viewer, want? There's no real room for challenging. There's no real room for something that could be a little bit complex and require you, the viewer, to do some of the work to figure out what a film is actually saying. It's entirely possible that a film could be presenting its story a certain way, but just through some basic filmmaking and narrative cues, you get a sense, it's actually saying the exact opposite of what it would seem to be saying. Movies like Pulp Fiction, The Wolf of Wall Street, movies that are very violent, very profane, they've got some sexuality in them, and it would seem to glorify these things. But there are moments and there are bits of dialogue that suggest that the director is actually doing the exact opposite. And so, but that requires some level of literacy when it comes to film and the language of film. And it also means that you can't just sit back and let the movie happen to you. You have to engage with the film. And I think increasingly you have people who aren't willing to do that. And certainly, a lot of Christian moviegoers are more conservative. I am also conservative, but as a function of that, there's this feeling of, hey, I'm paying my money, and when I pay my money for something, I want to get what I paid for. And this movie, I'm paying to see something that tells me I'm right. I'm paying for something to affirm my beliefs, not challenge them in any capacity. And so if something actually does challenge, not even necessarily your beliefs, but your idea of what a Christian film should be, there's this feeling of like, this must be a bad movie because I paid for one thing and it gave me something else. And I do think that's, and again, this is not to bash conservatives or Christians. I am a conservative Christian, but I do think we need to start thinking about art in a different way, not purely in a consumerist kind of way. It's not merely a product. It is a conversation between the filmmaker and the viewer. And unless we start thinking of it that way, then anything that's even vaguely challenging, like redeeming love, is going to just be almost completely put to the side because, well, that's not what we want. It's like, well, maybe it is what you want, but you don't know it because you're not willing to look at it from a certain angle.
Right. And, what would you say to filmmakers? Should they take the risk?
Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be a risk. You can put everything you have emotionally and artistically into a film, making the best possible film that you can, and the audience rejects it. Like, there's really, and if it does, then it makes it that much harder to make the next one. So you do have incentive to play it safe, but that's not going to do anybody any good if they do see it. And so there's a lot of advice that I can give. One is, and this is the advice I'd give to any filmmaker, is just inundate yourself with movies. You don't necessarily have to take a bunch of film courses, but just watch thousands of movies, starting from the beginning all the way through to the present day, because there are a lot of great filmmakers that never went to film school, and yet they churn out original, astonishing films. And it's just because they speak the language of film. That's a thing that I often talk about, is like, if you go to another country, you might, and you try to have sort of a general sense of what people are saying and the language they speak. But really, if you are in that country for a year, that will do more for you than any course you could possibly take. And so what I'd say is, like, immersion, like immerse yourself in film and filmmaking, and then maybe try to figure out why certain movies work for you and why certain movies don't. And I think just instinctively you become a better filmmaker because eventually you just start thinking cinematically. So that's the first bit of advice I'd give. And the second is, certainly from a screenwriting standpoint, it might have been Ernest Hemingway who said, write drunk and edit sober. And the idea here being, when you're writing your first draft, put everything on the table, even stuff that you yourself would find horrible. Like, oh my gosh, I don't approve of this behavior. Well, if it feels organic to the character in the moment, just put it all out there. You can cut it back if you want. In fact, I would recommend it, but put it all out there first. You'd be shocked what will work, as opposed to, again, this idea of, even in the first draft, like, okay, I see the story heading this way, but I can't do that, so let's artificially steer it this other direction. So yeah, just put everything out there. A lot of it is just immerse yourself in the story you're telling. Immerse yourself in movie watching. Start talking. Surround yourself, not all the time, but surround yourself with movie people. People whose comments about a film can actually help you to understand the film better, even if you don't agree with them. A lot of these are very basic and very fundamental, and yet, based on people that I've talked to at like the International Christian Film Festival, where you and I go somewhat regularly, I always have a little table there selling my book and hawking my wares and all that sort of thing. And people always come up and I talk with them, and like I said, these bits of advice are very simple, very basic. But the reason that I'm saying them is because a lot of Christian filmmakers aren't doing them, and yet they still want to make movies. They understand how engaging film can be, either as a ministry tool or just as an artistic property, and yet they're not willing to actually engage with the film that's actually there. Once you do that, it will immediately change the way you make movies.
Wow. So how can people watch this documentary?
So this film is available on a couple of different streaming services. I would recommend, there's one called Rediscover Television. And the reason that I recommend that one is because I have a second documentary, which is called Valley of the Shadow, the spiritual value of horror, and that is also available on Rediscover. So you can see Real Redemption and Valley of the Shadow on Rediscover Television, along with a 20-minute little documentary that I did about Jurassic World and how there's a lot more going on in that movie than you might think. And then I also briefly had a movie review show on there. So if you enjoy me, then check out Rediscover Television, because I'm all over that place.
Rediscover Television. All right. And then if people want to follow you, if they want to write you, where would they do that?
You can, I'd say you can get me through my podcast, More Than One Lesson, which unfortunately, that podcast I don't update very much. I have twin 2-year-old boys. And once that happened, something had to get pushed to the side. And unfortunately, it was going to have to be that one, because my other podcast, Battleship Pretension, is just more popular and requires more of me, and it brings in money. More Than One Lesson was only ever a sort of a labor of love. So that I haven't updated that since March, but I do still, the website's still available. The podcast is still available. And you can email me through that, Tyler@morethanonelesson.com. You can follow me on Twitter @morelessons. So yeah, that's probably where people can get me.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate you taking the time. I know that you've been really busy. You teach, I believe, right?
I do. I teach, and even though it's currently the summer, I'm teaching as part of this weird program where high school students from Europe come into Los Angeles, learn about film, and then in the evening they go take tours of different parts of the city and stuff. So that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Well, thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Plus, there's those 2-year-olds. They
of course,
they take up a lot of my time.
Of course. Now, folks, I did promise you that we would come back with Holly giving a review on a movie from Hollywood. But you know what, Tyler, you were just way too interesting. I took the entire show. We'll have Holly. We'll have Holly on the next one give us a review. It was a movie that just came out called Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris, and apparently it's okay for Christians to watch that movie. It's safe. So anyway, I just want to remind you folks that you can write us at faithunfilmtv@gmail.com. That's faithunfilmtv@gmail.com. And you can follow us, of course, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter @faithunfilmtv. And don't forget, you can check out a lot of our previous programs by going to YouTube and looking for Faith on Film TV. You'll be able to watch. I have over 120 shows there or something. So, Tyler, again, thank you.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Terrific. Folks, we'll see you next week.